In 1270, King Louis IX marched one last time under the cross, only to meet death on foreign soil. The Eighth Crusade began with faith and ended in tragedy at Tunis. Before we dive into this forgotten crusade, don't forget to subscribe and support our history journey. The Eighth Crusade of 1270, led by King Louis IX of France, stands as one of the last major crusading expeditions of the High Medieval period. Unlike earlier crusades, which directly targeted the Latin East or attempted to wrest the Holy Land from Muslim control, this campaign diverted to the North African coast, Tunis in particular, and ended in failure and tragedy after an epidemic decimated the Crusader camp and Louis himself died. The Crusades' brief operations, diplomatic outcomes, and its aftermath illuminate late medieval Mediterranean politics, dynastic rivalry, papal aims, commercial interests, and the changing feasibility of large-scale, cross-Mediterranean holy war. This essay examines the Eighth Crusade in context, its origins, motives, logistics, campaign events at Tunis, the death of Saint Louis, the negotiated settlement, and the consequences for Christendom and the Islamic polities of the Western Mediterranean. Louis XIII, reigning from the year 1226 to 1270, canonized in the year of our Lord 1297, and remembered as Saint Louis, embodied the ideal of the pious crusading monarch. He had already led the Seventh Crusade from the year 1248 to 1254 to Egypt, where he was captured and later ransomed. The experience did not deter him from renewing vows to take up the cross. Louis's personal devotion, his reputation for justice and reform at home, and the moral prestige he brought to crusading made his leadership in the 1270 expedition a potent symbol even before the campaign began. His piety, combined with a desire to restore Christian influence in the Eastern Mediterranean and to protect remaining Latin possessions, provided the public rationale for another expedition. However, the political map of the mid-13th century Mediterranean had shifted. The major Muslim power in the Eastern Mediterranean, Egypt, under the Ayyubids and then the Mamluks, posed a stronger, more consolidated force than in earlier decades. Meanwhile, dynastic and commercial rivalries, especially the expansion of Charles of Anjou, Louis's brother, in Sicily and southern Italy, recast Mediterranean priorities. These complex political dynamics helped shape the target and character of the 1270 expedition. When Louis prepared for a new crusade in the late 1260s, several factors influenced where the expedition might strike. Louis had originally intended to aid the Latin states in the east and to pressure Egypt, following the logic of previous campaigns. Yet by 1270, the idea of attacking Egypt directly, still logistically daunting, had to compete with other proposals. One critical influencer was Charles of Anjou, who as King of Sicily had both personal and political reasons to direct crusading energy toward North Africa. Control of Tunis would bolster Charles's commercial and strategic position and could weaken rivals. It might also produce payments or vassalage benefits that would assist future ventures to the east. Historians debate the degree to which Louis himself favored Tunis versus being persuaded by Charles and by the political calculus of the moment. Contemporary and later accounts suggest a mix of religious motive, the conversion or curbing of Muslim polities, and political financial aims among the crusading leadership. Tunis, as the seat of the Hafsid dynasty, was a wealthy North African port with extensive maritime links across the Mediterranean. Capturing Tunis, or coercing its emir into an alliance, offered the prospect of a base for further operations and of revenue to support a wider project against Muslim powers. Practically, Tunis was closer to the departure points in southern France and Sicily than Alexandria or Damietta, simplifying logistics for a trans-Mediterranean force composed largely of Western European contingents. Still, the diversion to Tunis has been criticized by contemporaries and modern historians as strategically unsound if the overriding objective was to relieve the Latin East. Preparations for the Crusade took shape in the late 1260s. On the ecclesiastical side, the papacy encouraged new campaigns and offered spiritual incentives, indulgences, and support for noble recruitment. Louis assembled a diverse force of French nobles and their retinues. Important participants included his brothers, notably Charles of Anjou, though Charles had his own separate interests, members of the Capetian family, and many princes and barons from northern France, Flanders, and Poitou. A notable contingent under Robert of Flanders and other northern lords joined, along with naval support from allied powers. The intention was to assemble a strong expeditionary force capable of maritime operation, ships, transports, horses, siege equipment, and supplies. Despite careful organization, the expedition faced logistical and weather constraints common to medieval maritime operations. The difficulty of maintaining healthy provisions for men and horses at sea, securing safe convoys across pirate-threatened waters, and coordinating combined fleets from different polities. Louis himself left in July 1270 from Aegis Mortis with a large fleet and an ethos of personal sacrifice. Though older than in 1248, he insisted on leading from the front and sharing the hardships of his men. The Crusader fleet sailed in summer 1270 and reached the environs of Tunis in early July. Contemporary chroniclers emphasize the initial optimism. The fleet disembarked with relatively little opposition, and the Crusaders conducted a series of landings and minor engagements, at times achieving local advantages. Some accounts record the capture of nearby positions and the seizing of supplies. The landings and early operations suggested that a decisive blow against the Hafsid regime might be possible if the Crusaders could secure enough resources and maintain health in the camp. However, the campaign's window for success was narrow. Mediterranean summers brought heat and disease. The marshy coastal grounds around Tunis, combined with supply problems and unfamiliar conditions for large European armies, created an environment in which disease could rapidly spread. Medieval armies suffered disproportionately from dysentery, typhus, malaria, and other epidemic illnesses when operating in coastal or marshy areas, especially when sanitation and clean water were compromised. The Crusader camp at Tunis proved vulnerable in precisely these ways. By mid-July into August, disease began to ravage the Crusader host. Sources from both Christian and Muslim chroniclers report a deadly outbreak, often described as dysentery or a similar epidemic illness, that killed many soldiers and camp followers. The toll included members of the nobility and key leaders. Most dramatically, King Louis IX fell ill and died on 25th August 1270. Accounts vary in precise medical diagnosis. Medieval chroniclers use terms and symptom descriptions that cannot be pinned down to modern clinical certainty. But the consensus is that disease, likely an acute intestinal infection, such as dysentery or typhus, aggravated by the harsher summer conditions, caused the king's death. Louis's death ended whatever fragile momentum the expedition had. Louis's death had immediate political and psychological effects. As the principal symbol and driving force of the crusade, the king's demise undermined morale and created a leadership vacuum. Louis's heir, Philip III, and other leaders faced a choice between pressing on under uncertain command or negotiating a withdrawal that would preserve survivors and salvage some honors. The decision to halt offensive operations and to negotiate was shaped by practical concerns: continued disease, fresh losses, and the lack of a decisive victory to justify further slaughter. In the wake of Louis's death, Charles of Anjou, who had been campaigning in the region and had his own fleet and political aims, took a leading role in negotiating with the Hafsid Emir of Tunis. The result was a diplomatic settlement, frequently labeled the Treaty or Agreement of Tunis, concluded to secure the safe evacuation of the Crusaders and to extract concessions from the emir. Terms reportedly included the release of Christian prisoners, guarantees of certain trading rights and protections for Christian merchants and clergy, and an indemnity or payment to the crusading leaders. Different sources quantify the payment differently, and medieval chroniclers often emphasize the bargain aspect. Charles's interest in monetary compensation and recognition of his regional influence was viewed skeptically by some contemporaries, who suspected mercenary motives. From the Hafsid perspective, the agreement allowed the regime of Tunis to survive a potentially existential threat while weakening its prestige and draining its coffers. For the Crusaders, the treaty permitted the withdrawal of surviving forces and some recovery of honor, though many contemporaries and later chroniclers judged the campaign a failure for failing to achieve any lasting crusading gains in the Levant. The negotiated settlement, then, represented a pragmatic and limited outcome: lives and some concessions in return for abandoning the broader crusading aims. After the treaty, Crusader forces embarked and returned across the Mediterranean. Some contingents, such as the English under Prince Edward, later Edward I, had arrived too late to play an effective role or had already sailed home. The remnants of Louis's expedition returned to Europe. Philip III assumed the French throne and faced questions about his capacity to sustain such expensive and hazardous enterprises. In France, Louis's moral stature as a saintly king grew in the years after his death, even as his crusading endeavors were scrutinized for their human cost and limited strategic success. Crusading fervor continued in Europe, but the failure in Tunis reinforced a longer-term trend: the difficulty of projecting sustained crusading power across the Mediterranean, and the growing dominance of regional Muslim polities in the Mediterranean littoral. Strategically, the Eighth Crusade altered few territorial realities in the short term. The Crusaders did not secure a lasting base in North Africa, nor did they relieve the Latin East. But it had important political and economic consequences. The expedition weakened the Hafsid emir's finances and prestige, and opened or reaffirmed trade relationships in the wake of the treaty. Charles of Anjou's ambitions in the region were reinforced in certain ways, though his continued involvement in Mediterranean politics would prove controversial and destabilizing elsewhere, notably in Sicily. The Crusades' failure to reach or assist the Levantine Christian states underscored the shift in where power and opportunity lay in the Mediterranean. Increasing importance of maritime commerce and of regional dynasties with seaworthy fleets and bases, for example, Genoa, Venice, the North African Emirates, the emerging power of the Mamluks in Egypt. Culturally and ideologically, Louis's death and subsequent canonization reinforced the image of the crusading Saint King, a model of pious self-sacrifice whose personal sanctity could obscure strategic failure. For later medieval writers and clerics, Louis's reputation as an exemplar of Christian kingship persisted, even as the European political elite debated whether large-scale crusades remained feasible or desirable. Modern historians have debated multiple aspects of the Eighth Crusade, chiefly why Tunis was selected, whether Louis truly intended Tunis as the primary target or whether he was persuaded by Charles, and how to balance praise for Louis's piety with criticism of the expedition's poor outcomes. Some scholarship emphasizes the Mediterranean context. The Crusade should be seen less as a straightforward attempt to reconquer the Holy Land and more as an expression of mid-13th century Mediterranean policy, where economic, dynastic, and papal interests intersected. Other studies scrutinize source biases. French chronicle traditions tended to sanctify Louis, while Arabic chronicles portray the Hafsid court's maneuvers and the resilience of Tunisian defenses. Cross-cultural readings, including Arabic sources, reveal the complexity of the encounter and challenge monolinear narratives of Christian aggression and Muslim passivity. Recent scholarship has also used the Tunis expedition to explore the role of disease in medieval warfare and statecraft. Epidemic outbreaks in medieval campaigns were not rare, but the death of a monarch on campaign, Louis's example, had a disproportionate effect on both immediate outcomes and on how contemporaries and later generations narrated the event. The interplay of environment, logistics, and human agency in these narratives has attracted interdisciplinary study, history, epidemiology, and environmental analysis. Viewed in long perspective, the Eighth Crusade marks a turning point. It is among the last of the large pilgrim military expeditions from Western Christendom, undertaken with such high royal involvement. In the century following 1270, crusading rhetoric continued, and smaller campaigns and orders persisted. But the era of mass royal-led crusades that had characterized the 12th and 13th centuries waned. The failure at Tunis signaled the growing difficulty of achieving decisive Christian gains in the Mediterranean through force alone, and it highlighted the importance of diplomacy, naval power, and commerce. Moreover, the expedition underscored the limits of sanctity as a substitute for clear strategic planning and local political knowledge. Louis IX's canonization and enduring legacy, especially in France, complicated assessments. He was both celebrated as a saint and criticized by some contemporaries who viewed his crusading projects as costly. For the Muslim polities of North Africa, the campaign was a severe challenge, but ultimately a survivable one that demonstrated tactical resilience and diplomatic adaptability. For Charles of Anjou, the campaign added to his Mediterranean footprint, though at a cost to his reputation in some circles. The Eighth Crusade of 1270, though short and often judged a failure in military terms, offers a concentrated case study of late medieval crusading, piety entwined with dynastic ambition, maritime logistics confronting environmental realities, and military enterprise giving way to negotiation and commerce. The death of Louis IX in Tunis turned the crusade from an act of royal piety into an emblem of crusading limits, an event that reinforced the sanctity of a king in Christian memory, even as it underscored the practical limits of holy war in a changing Mediterranean world. As historians continue to reassess the period, the Tunis expedition remains a rich subject for understanding the interplay of religion, power, and the unforgiving constraints of climate, health, and geography that shaped medieval politics.